Mr. Mays.
A few questions, if I can, Mr. Chair. Ms. North, if I heard you correctly, you said that this is your 15th meeting that you've come to this year. Is that correct?
I'm probably being a little bit facetious, but it feels like 15.
Okay. I'm just wondering if maybe the legislature didn't hear you as we were going through this process, because I heard from providers over and over and over again, and I'm just wondering again through the budgetary process. This extraordinary session was called the day after the budget was adopted, and if I want to make sure that the crisis didn't begin the day after the budget was adopted, because I heard you guys loud and clear, and I just wonder, there's that old where your heart or where your treasure is, there your heart is also, and I would just wonder if maybe our heart isn't with the developmentally disabled community, or somehow just after the budget was adopted, now we have to address this issue. Would you say that?
I think what I would say is that part of our job is to listen to everybody in what they're saying. And I've heard loud and clear that the governor is looking for some assistance on the revenue side. And I don't know, because I haven't talked to him, about whether or not that is solely the result of the developmental disability circumstance, or whether it's solely the result of Medi-Cal providers who also have not received much by way of help over the last several years. It is a combination of all those things. And whether or not it's what's left in the bank in reserves currently, or his concerns about budget year plus 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. The fact of the matter is, we're being told, we read the newspapers and watch TV also, that the governor believes that there's a revenue issue. So our problem is we're caught in the middle. We are cast into the middle of this, as are the other elements that are in the special session. And so being good soldiers, because at some point we are, it's our job to listen to what everybody's saying and try to be as flexible and as helpful and cooperative as we can be. But at the end of the day, we need some help. So were I to argue with the governor directly, I would certainly say, you can ignore this tomorrow, but you do so at your own peril. I mean, next year, the federal government, just as they've marched through the developmental centers, may start marching through our community Medicaid waiver programs. And guess what? 3-4 times the money loss is on the table. It's much bigger. And I'm not sure we're getting through with that message, but in part we're also appealing to you to help us get that message across. This is the penny wise, pound foolish problem. We're making it worse, and the state has a financial risk involved in this as much or more so than anybody else.
Thank you. I struggle a little bit because we adopted the largest budget that the state of California has ever adopted, and yet we didn't fund the necessary amount to be able to fund this community properly, and I struggle with that. The other thing that I have, and maybe Ms. Blakemore, you can answer the question, is what is the extending the MCO tax, which currently is already on the books? It doesn't go, it isn't a problem until June of next year. What does the MCO tax have anything to do with the 10% rate increase?
I don't think it necessarily does. It's an answer similar to what Ms. North just gave you, is the MCO tax as it currently is does not fund the developmental disability system. So it currently is structured isn't something that's going to be available for funding. So it's really getting serious in a bipartisan way about how are we going to take care of this system now. If that means identifying other funding sources, all of us here are happy to do that. I tried to give you my best thinking about what some alternatives are to addressing the MCO tax, which seemingly is getting sort of pushed back out. And from my perspective, we have a general fund surplus at the moment in ways that weren't anticipated. So I personally don't see a downside to making, if nothing else, a down payment that will ensure the stability of the system in the meantime. But whatever the mechanism is, all I can really say is that this system serves individuals who are at risk of losing where they live And the result is the state is at risk of losing larger amounts of federal dollars than it has ever lost before, and we have to find a solution to that, whatever that solution is.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments from members? Mr. Levine.
I do just want to make a comment after Mr. May's comments about the MCO tax, just to share some of the information, and also a little bit about the urgency about the MCO tax. I think the important thing to note is the Obama administration has said that our current MCO tax does not meet the federal guidelines. So we will lose $1.1 billion of federal matching funds. It will blow a huge deficit into our budget. If we don't do something now about this, you could say, well, it doesn't expire until June. If we were to introduce legislation, say, in session in January, and we went through the regular process, we may not have that bill pass through both houses of the legislature until the end of August, after the June expiration date that you're talking about. So if we don't do something now, what we're proposing perhaps in the next budget would be, how do we fill that deficit? Or how do we pass some tax that will then become law in the future, January of 2016, to solve a problem that was 6 months prior? And so that's some of the urgency there. And I think, Ms. Blakemore, you mentioned, I think quite aptly, the importance of trying to reach a bipartisan consensus, not just on how do we fill that deficit, but also on critical funding for developmental services that we all agree on, and that this is an opportunity to take care of those in that consensus building approach. But I really appreciate the question that you had and the opportunity to be able to share some of the thinking that many stakeholders have had on this issue preceding my introduction of AB4. Thank you.
Mr. Stone.
Well, and I'd also like to remind folks that when this body, the Assembly, passed out its budget, we really tried to deal with this issue. And Mr. Mays, if you remember that part, and we ended up, I think, losing it in the negotiation with the Senate and with the governor ultimately, because the governor, if we build into a legislative budget something he disagrees with, he will just blue pencil it. And under the current situation, when we get to budget votes that become very partisan, sort of Democrats vote yes, Republicans vote no, that's not conducive to the kinds of solutions we're going to need for ongoing structural stability for both the MCO world as well as the developmental disabilities funding. So for us, I think we really needed to come out into special session, be creative, bring both parties together in a way that hasn't happened before in order for us to get a true broader solution that's going to carry us further. So I appreciate your questions, appreciate your interest in the issue. This body has really tried to lead on this, but we really need to work together, figure out how we address the revenue side in a way that's going to be acceptable to the governor and to the Senate in order to fill the gaps that we're talking about here.
Thank you, committee members, for your comments, your questions. I want to thank this panel. Thank you, Ms. Blakemore, Ms. McKinney, Mr. Bradshaw, Ms. North, for your comments, input, and engagement. We're going to call our final panel to the table. This is a panel on program and fiscal oversight. We have John Doyle, Chief Deputy Director, and Brian Winfield, Interim Deputy Director, Community Services Division, Department of Developmental Services. And we also have John Popodak, Chief Financial Officer, Association of Regional Center Agencies. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Mr. Doyle and Mr. Winfield, whenever you're ready, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. John Doyle, Developmental Services. I wanted to talk a little bit about the types of program and fiscal oversight that the department currently has in place with the regional centers. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there are 21 private nonprofit regional centers. The state contracts with each of those regional centers to ensure that consumer services are provided and that the regional center operations are funded. While the department has broad authority under California law to ensure regional centers are operating effectively and efficiently, we view this as a partnership. We work with regional centers to ensure that consumers are receiving appropriate services consistent with their individual program plans. We currently conduct a number of oversight activities, and I'm not. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's some of the more pertinent ones to, I think, providing really good fiscal and programmatic oversight. On an ongoing basis, we review special incident reports. Those are issues where a consumer is perhaps missing from the regional center, or there's abuse or exploitation, serious injury, unexpected hospitalization. Anytime there is a death, those things are investigated as special incident reports. So the department reviews those on an ongoing basis. We also review regional center purchase of service policies, staff instructions and training materials, board meeting agendas and minutes, notifications to consumers and providers, regional center conflict of interest statements, and we follow up on complaints regarding the provision of services, whistleblower complaints that come in either from family members, employees, or the public, and just general complaints related to services in the system. On a quarterly basis, or on an as-needed basis in some cases, the department sends representatives to attend regional center board meetings. We perform an annual survey of regional center administrative expenditures, personnel salaries, executive director compensation, service coordinator caseloads, regional center board composition, and we ensure that regional centers are posting information on service disparities. Every 2 years, the department conducts a fiscal compliance audit of regional centers. So in addition to the oversight that the department provides, there are other entities that also assist in providing oversight and review. The State Council on Developmental Disabilities has the authority to resolve disputes between consumers and regional centers. And Disability Rights California, you just heard from Ms. Blakemore, has the ability to conduct investigations into allegations of abuse and neglect. In addition, regional centers also are required at various intervals to provide a number of state and federal reports to various agencies. This includes Franchise Tax Board, EDD, U.S. Department of Labor, and the list gets fairly lengthy, but these are some of the entities that are also required that the regional centers are also required to report to. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson Bonta and committee members, for the opportunity to speak today. My name is John Popnek. I'm the Chief Financial Officer for the Association of Regional Center Agencies. I've been asked to discuss regional center monitoring of services and vendors. There's three areas to cover in this. The regional centers conduct fiscal audits of vendors. They also conduct quality assurance and program reviews of various vendors. And then there's also the requirement for a lot of vendors to have independent fiscal audits as well. The regional center fiscal monitors program first started in the 1980s. Each regional center was allocated one fiscal monitor to provide to do audits of all the vendors that the regional centers had. Regardless of the size of the regional center, each regional center just got one. In 1998, in response to concerns of HCFA, which is the precursor agency to CMS, An audit that they conducted, they had concerns over lack of adequate fiscal monitoring of the vendors. And so the number of vendors that regional centers were allotted was increased to 55. In 2004, in response to a recommendation by the LAO, auditing of vendors was split between regional centers and the department. And the number of regional centers allotted to number of fiscal monitors allotted to regional centers was drastically decreased. Regional centers were tasked with providing, doing audits of residential facilities of 6 or fewer beds, and other vendors that received more than, less than $100,000 in funds from regional centers. Regional centers conduct different types of audits. There's audits of service providers' cost statements to ensure expenses are accurately reported. Staffing audits to ensure that service provider has a number of staff that's required by Title 17, and that the staff meet the education, experience, and credential requirements as specified in Title 17. Typically, this is a type of audit that is performed of residential facilities, day programs, supported living, and other like programs. Audits of community care facilities, their handling of the client's personal incidental monies are also conducted. Billing audits are conducted to ensure that the units of service that the providers bill the regional centers for are accurate and are supported by documentation such as time cards, staffing schedules, attendance reports, and other documentation. Contract audits are performed of those those vendors that are on contract with the regional center, and as to provide assurance that they are providing the services in accordance with the terms of the contract. Based on the number of certain service providers vendored by a regional center, department determines the minimum number and types of audits that regional centers should perform each year. For this current fiscal year, regional centers are supposed to conduct 252 audits. For the last year, the data is available. It's 13-14. Regional centers were required to perform 251 audits and actually performed 477 audits. Versus, the vendor pool is 45,000 plus vendors out there. Some of the challenges faced with regional centers faced with audits, for this year, they're funded for only 24.5 fiscal monitors. This is less than half the number that they had in 2003. They had 55 then. The regional centers served 159,000 clients then and are now serving over 280,000. So the population has grown greatly, and the number of fiscal monitors has decreased. Quality assurance or QA reviews and program monitoring by regional centers. Title 17 provides that the regional centers with the authority to access the records of any service provider to review. It also provides for the termination of vendorization for noncompliance with Title 17 or the Lanham Act. Regional center case managers are required to meet quarterly with their clients not living at home with their parents or guardian. These visits generally take place in the client's residence, whether it be community care facility or supported living, and also in the day program. While the purpose of these visits is to review the client's IPP and note the progress made on their goals, it also gives them a chance to casually look around at the residence or the program and see what condition it is. Regional Center Facility Liaison conducts annual reviews of all residential facilities. Annual reviews include looking at staff schedules for service level requirements, personnel training files, sampling of consumer records and charts, documentation that services are being provided in accordance with the program designed for that facility or program. In addition to this, the Department of Social Services conduct reviews of all residential facilities. And in addition to the ability of regional centers to monitor the service of rehabilitation programs, those programs must also be accredited by the Commission of Accreditation of Rehabilitation Facilities, or CARF. Department of Public Health also conducts reviews of intermediate care facilities and skilled nursing facilities. So there's multiple agencies involved reviewing vendors. There's also, as John mentioned, special incidents reports. Regional centers have special incident coordinators who track the SIRS, they're commonly called, and interface with regional center staff and the department. The vendors are required to report special incidents to the regional center. Regional center collects those incidents along with the plans that they develop to mitigate future incidents and sends that on to the department. The regional centers have risk management committees which review these SIRS and look for trends for among either vendors or certain clients. Challenges face regional centers face with QA reviews and program monitoring. Up until 2009, there was a requirement to conduct triennial community care facility reviews, and this triennial was a very in-depth review. But there was a team of regional center staff that go out to the facilities and spend a whole day out there looking through all the records and checking cabinets for food and giving a good, thorough review. This was in 2009 as a cost-cutting measure. This review was eliminated. Anyways, due to prioritization of how your staffing, just like with fiscal monitors and the QA people, you're always regional centers are always trying to staff their caseload first. Hire as many case managers as possible. So case management gets the first focus, and then quality assurance teams and vendor fiscal monitors, they're lower on the list as far as hiring priorities. And of course, there's the independent audits of the providers. In 2011, legislation was passed that required service providers who receive more than $250,000 in a year to have an independent review report of their financial statements, and if they receive more than $500,000, they were required to have an independent audit. Unfortunately, there are limitations in these types of audits because their focus is on the financial statements, not necessarily on the program. As in the review, the report reads. Part of the report reads, a review includes primarily applying analytical procedures to management's financial data and making inquiries of company management. A review is substantially less in scope than an audit, the objective of which is the expression of an opinion regarding the financial statements as a whole. And then the last paragraph goes, based on our reviews, we are not aware of any material modifications that should be made to the accompanying financial statements in order for them to be in conformity with accounting principles generally accepted in the United States of America. And in the financial audit report, it says, we conducted our audits in accordance with auditing standards generally accepted in the United States of America. Those standards require that we plan and perform the audit to obtain reasonable assurance about whether the financial statements are free of material misstatement. An audit includes examining on test basis evidence supporting the amounts and disclosures in the financial statements. So you can see these doesn't really give you much information as to how the program is operating and how the clients are being served for these audits. Thank you. That's all I have.
Thank you. Do we have any questions or comments from members? I have a couple quick ones. I was in particular fascinated by your final comment about whether or not the audits actually shed any light on the quality of the services provided to the clients. And so I just wanted to ask you a general question. Do you think the current oversight system is adequate, and do you think that if additional resources are provided to the system as a whole, then it would warrant more effective oversight?
I believe we need more resources in order to provide better oversight, definitely.
So my understanding is that some of the audits and oversight reviews are discretionary. If there was resources connected to mandatory oversight and audits, do you think that could be helpful?
Well, there are minimum requirements now for a number of audits that the regional centers must accomplish. And like I said, they do. Most regional centers meet or exceed those requirements every year. But being able, with the number of vendors out there, it's definitely we need a lot more fiscal monitors in order to get out there and do more audits of these vendors, and same thing with the quality assurance. I mean, we really need to have more quality assurance folks at the regional centers to go out and do the monitoring and reviews.
Great, thank you. Mr. Doyle, did you have anything to add about audits and whether additional audits that were funded by the state could be helpful in providing additional quality assurance and add additional value?
Well, I think that additional audit requirements, audits conducted properly can always provide value, and the issue I think becomes a resource question. That right now there are approximately 45,000 vendors that provide services to our system. We have the capacity right now to audit just a very small percentage, less than 1% of those vendors each year. Audits take time, and so again, it becomes a resource issue.
Yeah, understood. My question is more around if there were additional resources, would those be prudent investments in terms of the value that the audits that those additional resources fund could provide?
I think that they could be. They a lot of times when audits are conducted, there are issues that are found that a lot of times it's misunderstanding about perhaps how to bill for something, things like that. So, one of the things that the department has heard through the work group process that we're currently engaged in is that it would be beneficial to have to be more proactive, to be working with providers to give them good information so that they don't end up with problems during an audit. So it would be the idea of working with them in advance to make sure they understand proper billing procedures and things like that.
Great, thank you. And just one final question. Do the audits the vendors have to obtain themselves generate useful information for either the department or the regional centers?
I think from a department's perspective, to the extent that we get those, like any situation, some of the audit reports are useful, and we get information on problems that exist. But so it would depend on the particular audit.
Anything to add to that from the regional center's perspective?
No.
Okay. Fantastic. I appreciate your participation on this panel. Thank you, Mr. Doyle, Mr. Winfield, Mr. Papadak, for your testimony and your comments and your engagement.